Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. So Tony Khan did an interview with Bloomberg, and I'm going to sit down and talk about some of the things that he said, and because some of the things that he said can be true if you eliminate context or if you add context. Sometimes people just throw data out there. We need to recognize that AEW is a private company and does not have to divulge any details of their dealings and stuff like that. So that gives them an advantage in certain respects of things that we know and things that we can take into account. So I'm not going to use a lot of data. I'm just going to kind of, matter of fact, I'm not going to use any data at all. I'm just going to just look at what he said, and we're going to take into account certain things that we think that he may be leaving out. Okay, so he talked about AEW. He was questioned, like, what is AEW about? He talked about it being the number one show on Wednesdays and Fridays. And he built some of the most exciting young stars in wrestling. And it included new stars. And then they went out and signed some big top names, some big free agents. Then he says they have a diverse roster with diverse life experiences and diverse backgrounds of all ages and experiences. Then he says they have the most star power of any wrestling company, which is a product of quote-unquote elbow grease. I don't know if they have more star power. I don't know how you quantify that. Do you look at pure names? Because I'm guessing most of WWE's quote names are either retired or already gone. So if you want to say that certain wrestlers in WWE and AEW rather are bigger draws than they were in WWE, I think that's a question. You know, that's a pretty big question. I'm not entirely sure whether it's true or not. I guess a good way to look at that would be looking at merchandise sales. But you'll also have to, again, in certain situations, you'll have to eliminate outliers. For instance, CM Punk is a huge financial boon to AEW. But that huge financial boon to AEW has been because he was sitting on his couch for 7 years. And he's still old enough to jump off his couch and get back in the ring, right? So if you were to gauge CM Punk's drawing power, why would you note his big return? His big return did more numbers than he ever did as a normal wrestler on the roster. You know, he's definitely sold more t-shirts probably than ever before, and that kind of thing. So you talk about somebody people were patiently waiting for to come back, and he spiked ratings and he spiked merchandise sales. So people would say, well, he's a huge draw. I would say, kind of, you know, he was not that bad. He's better than most people on the roster, sure. But when you take into account that he was gone for 7 years, and this is new, fresh merchandise that he was able to put out for the first merchandise he's had in 7 years, it's a completely different ball game. You know, it's an outlier. If you want to compare him to, I wouldn't compare him to John Cena, because John Cena is not a regular wrestler in WWE, or Brock Lesnar, or even like Bill Goldberg or somebody like that. So as somebody who is going to be a regular on television, we will have to see in the future whether CM Punk is really that big of a merchandise mover and TV mover. But we do know that a lot of people bought tickets and a lot of people bought merchandise to see CM Punk for the first time in 7 years. How long is that going to last? You know, especially since they're just adding new people every single month, it seems. So that's a good question, but I don't know how do you quantify star power. I would do a Google trend. Last time I did a Google trend, Bianca Belair was more well known and looked for than Kenny Omega. But I haven't done a Google trend in a while. But even if we were to do a Google trend to see who has the most star power, who has the most searches, it's also going to be manipulated by the fact that some people have just debuted, like CM Punk has just debuted. So his Google trends are going to be outrageous. Same thing with Bryan Danielson. So those kind of situations, it's going to be difficult to compare because just like I said, you're going to talk about spikes due to surprises and different things like that. So how do we gauge star power in real terms is very difficult and very nebulous. So he was asked whether this was his dream, which of course it is. We're not going to get into that. So he was asked the question, how do you compete with WWE as the market leader? Tony Khan responded that the number one wrestling show on television was Dynamite. And quote, in some aspects, they are the market leader. In other important business aspects, we are the market leader. Then he says that they compete by offering an alternative product that featuring wrestlers that were not being featured in WWE. And he saw the vulnerability in the market leader and decided to, quote, bootstrap a new business and said that in a lot of significant business metrics, we are the number one worldwide leader. Now, the question about that would be in what metrics? And essentially, you already know the answer to that in Medemos. But he also mentioned pay-per-view buys. Now, he talked about, All Out was the most profitable pay-per-view they've ever done, which is probably true. He didn't give any exact numbers of how many people bought All Out. But at $50 a pop, it probably did pretty well. So from this perspective, he's saying, okay, you look at our pay-per-views, and knowing, and he even said it, WWE isn't in the pay-per-view business, but there are other wrestling promotions that are. So when he says we're number one in a lot of business metrics, and then he goes into pay-per-views because he's asked about pay-per-views, pay-per-view is an important business model. It's just that WWE doesn't get involved in it. Are they number one in pay-per-view? Absolutely. Nobody else is going to do 200,000 buys on a pay-per-view, especially since, the closest competitors are people who are going to be in the back pocket of AEW, like Impact, for instance, right? So you can say that's an important business metric, but of course, he's asked about the audience. So what do we know about the audience? And he says, quote, "We have the youngest skewing audience in all of sports programming. That Dynamite and Rampage are number one shows on cable in the 18 to 49 demographic. That they have a more affluent fan base, and really people of all backgrounds." And he says that our fan base are more likely to be college educated, and that it's very attractive to advertisers with the young and engaged audience. Now, of course, this is what caught a lot of attention for people who were, asking questions about this whole thing. What does he mean by we have the youngest skewing audience in all of sports programming and in all of TV? Well, he's looking at a higher percentage of their demographic that fit the 18 to 49. So the best way to look at this is all other sports have so many more fans and appeal to so many more demographics, especially the lower class demographics and things like that, that the 18 to 49 does not make a substantial amount of their audience. Now, it does for WWE, because WWE doesn't have the audience of, let's say, the NFL or the NBA, right? So when you see Raw's ratings and they've gone down during football season, obviously football has eaten into their demographic, right? So because everyone else has such a bigger fan base than AEW, he can make that comment. And it's true, but you have to again, take out the context. Take out the context that, look at all the many millions of people who watch the NFL. There are a wide range of ages and races and demographics. And you do the same thing with Major League Baseball, even though I think Major League Baseball tends to lean more white. And I think the NBA tends to lean more black, and the NFL tends to lean more black. And WWE leans white in certain areas and black in others. We've talked about SmackDown numerous times on this show. That, SmackDown is the number one wrestling show among blacks and Hispanics. We'll talk about this in a minute, because I saw a site that posted something Dave Meltzer said about wrestling demographics. And it's almost the exact same thing he said about Indians. And it needs to be said again and again, but we'll talk about that in 1 second. So he talks about them having the youngest audience. He's talking about they have the youngest audience among people who are watching. They have the young, so they don't have the audience of WWE, but they do have a higher percentage of their audience in the demographic. So that's what they mean, okay? Because Raw has a larger audience. Raw has 500, 600,000 more viewers than Dynamite, and SmackDown has even more viewers than Raw. So when you look at it from that perspective, and let's not even get involved with the NFL and all that kind of stuff. They get like 0.4s and all that kind of wild stuff, 0.7, 7 point, or something for the NFL, because it's a national thing. So he's getting away with saying stuff like this because you're looking at a higher percentage of a smaller pie versus a bigger pie, which is still going to be more people in the long term. Like, if in the NFL, if it's 7 million people watching and they get a 3 point something in the TV ratings, that's massive, So it's a completely different ball game. So he can get away with that. That's a little bit of a weasel thing. So he's asked about the male female split. Like, what's the male female split on AEW? And he says, I would say probably maybe like a 5-3 split. Now, you would think that somebody who runs an analytics company, as he talks about later in this thing, would know this offhand. But it's almost as if he's just trying to eyeball it. Like, he should know this, right? He should know what's the male to female split. He says that, they have a huge male audience, which they dominate in the 18 to 49. And that's their bread and butter audience. But they have in their shows a great crop of, quote, young female audience. So this is where we have to stop to talk about Uncle Dave and some of his comments that he made about WWE and their audience. In saying that previously, of course, we know that Dave Meltzer has said that a lot of WWE's YouTube views are Indians. And because Indians can't be monetized, they are not attractive, boo, to advertisers. In saying that, he talked about WWE's audience being very, very ethnic or heavily Mexican. And because of that, it's not attractive to advertisers. He has said stuff like this again before. Look, here's the thing. When you're talking about advertisers and whether people are likely to spend money, because that's really what we get at here is ethnic people have lower incomes than whites. So what AEW is saying, without saying it, is that they cater to the white male demographic. That's what he's saying without saying it, right? Is that because when you look at everything that he said, it all points to the fingers of the white male demographic. They have more money than the average fan. And they have a higher level of education than an average wrestling fan. Now, wrestling fans in general have always been lower class. Always. When you go back and you watch wrestling from anywhere, you're going to see lower class, blue collar people. That has always been the target audience for pro wrestling. It never has been to target college age or people who are in college. Even in the Attitude Era, it appealed to the frat boys and all that kind of stuff with the suck it and all that stuff too. So that was what you would call an aberration. But those guys were relatively low income as well. They just had more disposable income at the time. If you're an advertiser, one of the things you're going to be looking at is what's called a conversion rate. How many people purchase a product that is being sold, right? So if you're looking at wrestling, let's give AEW something. Let's say they have 100. That's not 100. Let's say they have a million viewers. Let's say that's their average. From now on, it's going to be 1 million viewers. And they have their highest pay-per-view was 200,000. Since he won't give an official number, he says well over 200,000, but it wasn't 300,000, right? If it was 300,000, he'd say 300,000. If it was 250, he'd probably say 250. So if you say that they have 1 million average viewers and their highest pay-per-view was 200,000 buys at $50 a piece, that's a 20% conversion rate, right? That means 20% of the audience who is watching Dynamite every week bought the pay-per-view, 20%. What we know from WWE, because they have to disclose this information, what they did when the network was around, they had 1.2 million buyers for the network at $10 a piece. That was monthly, right? If Raw has, let's say on the low end, 1.5 million viewers every week, then the conversion rate for WWE is higher, much, much higher than the conversion rate for AEW. If most of your audience is paying for your product monthly, then that will be attractive to the advertisers. As opposed to only 20% of my audience buys advertising. If I can tell somebody 60% of my audience, they may be low income, but they actually purchase what I put out there. As opposed to my audience is higher income, but they're less likely to purchase what I actually make. If you are an advertiser, which one would you go with? You would go with the people who are actually spending money. So this is a completely pointless and silly argument. You want people to spend money. WWE has proven that they can get their audience to spend money. They have proven that they can get their audience, they can direct their audience to certain things. This is what they did the zombie match, right? They were paid to do the zombie match to direct people to the Netflix movie. And then the Netflix movie was a success. Being able to make money for your partners and your advertisers and your sponsors and all that kind of stuff is an important business metric. What AEW is saying is look at our young audience, and people are saying, okay, but are they buying it? And then you could say, well, we have high merchandising. And it's like, but is it artificially high because a guy just jumped off his couch and came to the wrestling show, which may be the case. Ticket sales are going to be a crazy thing that we can look into. That's also part of conversion rate. Are people going to the shows? Both WWE and AEW seem to be doing pretty well as far as ticket sales are concerned. They're different prices, though. I woke up this morning to see people say, oh, well, AEW is selling more tickets in some market than WWE. And I instantly went and looked, and yes, the WWE tickets are higher. That's almost always going to be the case, you know? So, but WWE has broken all kind of records with their attendance and all that kind of stuff lately. So we can, if we even say it's going to be a completely different business metric because WWE is going to be a different scale. But there's a lot of people who want to compare the two, and they shouldn't. Ultimately, I'm not going to be one of those people who say, if you're a progressive, let's say, you will look at AEW and say that they cater to the white male demographic. I say that all money is green. It doesn't matter. If white males prefer AEW over WWE, that's fine with me. But I already know that even historically speaking, blacks and Hispanics are more into SmackDown, specifically SmackDown, than other wrestling shows. And it's shown. Another way you can look at their audience is you can physically look at the audience, which if you look at the audience of AEW is mostly over 30 white males, right? And some women a smattering of women in that same demographic. When you look at WWE's actual audience, you see larger numbers of children, people of color, women, stuff like that, right? It also reflects in their commercials. You can look at the commercials of AEW and tell what demographic they're hitting pretty hard. If you always wonder, like if you ever watch like old Ring of Honor and you see like Jay Lethal doing knee and back brace commercials, and it's because when it was syndicated, it was on in the middle of the day, and they're probably were more likely to get older people watching the show. When you look at the commercials for SmackDown or Raw and the commercials for Dynamite and Raw are pretty much similar, you know, but, you know, it's obviously going to be a little bit different. But that tells you a lot about the demographics and whether people are engaged with the show as well. So when Meltzer goes and talks about people being of low income, for instance, I say it all the time, and this is a thing that people need to get into their heads, is that income is not destiny. Just because somebody is poor right now does not mean they will be poor forever. I don't like when Meltzer said, I know I put this on Twitter and a lot of people jumped and said that Meltzer was a racist. And that, the stuff that he says about India is racist. The stuff he's saying about Mexicans are racist. It's like, yes, Mexicans are low income, but Mexico has plenty of wrestling promotions, So apparently people are paying to see wrestling in Mexico because Mexico is a poor country, but they have pretty good sized crowds. They can support a wrestling business of their own. India is a little bit different, but just because somebody is of a lower income doesn't mean that they don't spend their money, which they do. Blacks and Hispanics have a pretty good rate of buying power in the United States. And as I've just said, WWE has managed to find a way by lowering prices on purchasing pay-per-views through the network and now through Peacock, which is even lower than the network. They can now engage with the product a lot more than paying $50 for a pay-per-view, even though it's quarterly, So I don't like that Meltzer says that. It shows that he does not know much about demographics, or he thinks that demographics is destiny when it's not. Sure, AEW's fan base is whiter, wealthier, and more male, but you also need to recognize that individual advertisers are going to have individual kinds of they want to expand their reach. Not everybody wants to appeal to the white male demographic 18 to 49, right? There's going to be people who are going to say, we want to lean more into, things that women are into, things that black people are into. And when you do that, you may get a lower number of people in the 18 to 49 demographic, but it might be the target audience that you want. Sometimes you hit the mega load. You become the NBA or the NFL, which appeals to everybody, but it especially appeals to blacks and Hispanics, and therefore they spend a lot of money on tickets and jerseys, and they watch the stuff on TV, and they consume a lot of media around the NFL and the NBA. That's the mother load, right? But, wrestling is a little bit different. It's a niche product. It's very niche. And because it's niche, you want to try to diversify that audience as much as possible. When WWE is doing like Rolling Loud and all that kind of stuff. And to this point, he was asked about doing the Arthur Ashe Stadium show, where he talked about, oh, well, there's wrestling fans there as well. And, it's a different audience, but it's a paying audience, and it's a wrestling fans audience. And it's a tennis stadium, I believe it is, right? It's tennis. And nobody had ever done a show there. And it's like, maybe there's a reason. Now, this show is going to be successful. Don't get it wrong. But that's because he's leaning, again, very heavily into his demographic. People who go to tennis shows, but it's going to be people who like wrestling, and it's just going to be a big venue for them to go to. And that's a good thing. So I'm an all money is green person. But the facts remain what they are, is that when you lean into the demographics of the United States, the white males have higher levels of income than everybody else in the country. And if they're the people who are watching your show, they're the people who are spending money on your show, those are the people you're going to see in the crowd, which we do, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what it is. So one of the last things he talked about that was really interesting was, what kind of pitch did he give to these big names to come to AEW? And he said that he had different conversations with all of them, but he had individual reasons why each one of them would be a good fit. And he had different stories and different ideas, and that, mostly that he believes in this business and that he's willing to do the work, and talked about the different stories in a different presentation. So it was about a 30-minute interview that he did. And from that interview, there's been a lot of pieces floating around. Mostly that Meltzer was saying that, AEW has wealthier fans, and that AEW has a more higher educated fan base. But when you have to you have to look at this thing from the progressive idea. Progressives, not to get too political on you, but progressives have routinely said that college education equals smartness, right? That if you are college educated, that means that you're smart. Without, realizing that, without looking at the amount of people walking around with debt from college. Like if you're in debt from college, you're probably not that smart. But also, do I think Meltzer was trying to be racist? No, I don't. I think that I think he's just ignorant, man. Like he's on the outside looking in, he's being told these things, or he's, Googling stuff, and this is what he comes up with. Do I think Tony Khan is trying to be deceitful? No, I think that he is very careful with what he says. He says a lot of things that, that he can't be proven wrong on about. So, or if you add context or separate context, then you will figure out how he came to the conclusion that he came to. And that's just kind of how it is. So I didn't make this video to combat what Tony Khan said, because if that was the case, I'd have did like some real research and went and dipped into, what the real average age of a WWE viewer is. Because, Meltzer has been saying for a long time that it's over 50. It's over 50. But then when you look at TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, everything where that young people traditionally use, it's WWE, WWE, WWE. It's not AEW at all. Like, and that's important, because if you look at WWE, they pay attention to all the ways people are consuming media. They aren't just reliant on television. And they've been saying that 100 times. They don't just rely on television. Television is just one metric. And yes, it's their highest earning metric, because TV networks have a lot of money. But it's not the only metric that they look at. They're looking at how people engage their content in every single way. They've been looking to find ways of turning people who see their TikTok videos, their tweets, their YouTube videos, turning those people into consumers, people who pay. That's what they want to do. You know, you can look at it for free on Twitter or TikTok or whatever. Or are you going to buy a t-shirt? Or are you buy the dolls? You're going to go to the show? That kind of thing is what they're looking at. AEW is just, you know, hyper focused on television because for a long time, that's really what wrestling has been. It's been a television show. And they to be quite honest, they need to be stable somewhere. And I think being stable on TV is a good thing. But they also need to grow their audience, you know, and with some people believing that AEW is the number one wrestling show in the 18 to 49 demographic on Friday nights at 10 o'clock and Wednesdays at 8 o'clock. And it's like, if you truly believe that you were the number one wrestling show, run up against SmackDown. You know, if you have that much faith in Grand Slam, run it at 8 o'clock instead of running it at 10. You know, so that's the kind of thing that you have to look into. Is they're doing a lot of weasel stuff where they're kind of saying, oh, we're the number one show in the 18 to 49 demographic on cable at 10 o'clock on Fridays. You know, they're getting really, really, really down to the granular details, but making grand statements. And it's okay, you know, whatever. I don't think AEW should run opposite Raw or opposite SmackDown. I think it's silly. They would rather run on Saturday than run on Mondays. No matter what anybody tells you about SmackDown or Raw being beat in the ratings by Dynamite, they're never going to run head to head because they know better. It'll split the audience, and if the audience ends up split, they're afraid they might lose market share. So what they're going to do is try to protect their market share, and they're going to be able to do that by just running on Saturdays. If they get preempted by sports, they'll just run on Saturdays, or they'll run on after the sports at 10 o'clock or something like that. It's just a smarter way of doing business, but they can get their media friends to say, oh, it's the number one wrestling show on all of cable. And, you know, then when you start digging into it, it becomes very, very, very specific in how they get around this, you know. But whatever. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time, and I'll talk to you later.